Hi, friends. This is Adam Shoemaker, Rector at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, back for another edition of Rector's Corner. And I'm very happy to have with me today a former Charleston friend who has moved away, Dr. Matthew Cressler, a Cajun friend. And if you follow me on social media, he is also a fellow Liverpool fan. That is why he is wearing the Liverpool colors as Liverpool. By the revealing of this video, will have already lifted the Premier League trophy. Great to have you on, Matt. And Matt is the author of Authentically Black and Truly Catholic: The Rise of Black Catholicism and the Great Migrations. He's a historian, and given his area of work, we're here to talk about the new pope. We are Episcopalians, but there is that fascination. I want to begin by asking you, just how surprising was it that the conclave elected an American-born pope?
Well, first, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you, Adam, and to be in a conversation that includes brother and sister and sibling Episcopals. And I was gonna make a joke, how surprising, incredibly surprising. I mean, no one really could have foreseen it, a U.S. American being elected Pope. And I was gonna say, as a Catholic whose Catholicism is not, shaped by who happens to be in the chair of Peter on a day-to-day basis. Um, Nevertheless, like when that conclave was meeting and the black smoke kept going up, I was locked in. And so I actually happened to be able to watch that live, from my home. Yeah, and it was really shocking. I think that despite what we US Americans might think, given the way that our news cycle and our kind of like public discourse operates, um, most Catholics in the world are not US Americans, and have a very different sense of the United States role in the world. And I think that there was a sense that um, it would be a long time, if ever, that there would be a US American born Pope, both out of a sense that um, not wanting to consolidate spiritual power, with the kind of, tremendous, geopolitical power of the United States. But also just because, if we think historically, kind of European popes have been the ones elected for most of the last 1,000 years. But increasingly, the global Catholic population is a population of the global South. So even if we get away from the kind of geopolitics of it, just thinking representatively of where the center of gravity is in global Catholicism, it's surprising on that front too.
So, talk to us a little bit about what we know about Pope Leo, and why you think he ended up being a compelling choice amid that recent conclave.
So I think there are a few things that we know about him that kind of give us indications as to why he was elected. So first, while he was born in Chicago and as a U.S. and thus like heralded as a U.S. American Pope, he spent most of his career as a priest and bishop and provincial. Um, Outside of the United States, and much of it in Peru, where he eventually served as bishop. And so there's a way in which he is a U.S. American pope. He's a Chicagoan pope, but he's also a Peruvian pope. He's being embraced he's a a naturalized Peruvian citizen. And so in that sense, he's kind of inheriting the legacy of Pope Francis, his predecessor, right? So he very much is someone who was formed by, understands, and missions to um, South American, Latin American Catholics. In his first address, he switched from the standard Italian not into English, but into Spanish, right? And so I think that that is one thing that we know about him in terms of following the legacy of Pope Francis. Even more directly than that, I mean, Pope Francis eventually appointed him to be one of the people overseeing the bishops who were elevated in dioceses across the world. And so he worked hand in hand with Pope Francis to kind of make and remake what kind of ecclesial leadership looked like around the world. So again, a way in which he worked hand in hand with then Pope, the late Pope Francis. And that second part, I think, on if we want to think about like the politics of the conclave, is a crucial one to think about. One of the things that a lot of people were commenting on as they were entering conclave to elect the Pope was how little the cardinals who were going there knew each other. So many, so Pope Francis elevated so many new cardinals in so many new places around the world um, to great effect. Like he basically remade the College of Cardinals in the image of global Catholicism. So, made it much more representative of folks around the world. But this was the first time that many of them were meeting each other. And so there was a sense that the conclave might take a really long time because they would have to get to know each other before they could begin to kind of reach a consensus. Having said that, they might not have known each other, but they all more or less knew Robert Francis Prevost because he was, now Pope Leo the 14th. He was the guy who was, in effect, like helping to elevate them in the first place. So I think there's a way in which he makes sense as an inheritor of Francis's legacy, and also a way in which he makes sense if we think about just the practicality and politics of the conclave as someone who had built a relationship with lots and lots of cardinals who had a sense of who he was and how he might carry on the legacies of Francis.
Well, and the name that a pope chooses, often it feels to me says something about their priorities, about perhaps what the shape of their papacy might look like. And obviously, it was very significant for the former Cardinal Bergoglio to choose the name of Francis, which I love because I'm a product of a Franciscan high school in Long Island, New York, even though he was a Jesuit. And now we have this Augustinian who has chosen the name of Leo. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of that name and what that might signal about the new pope's priorities.
Didn't realize that you also had Franciscan roots. I graduated from St. Bonaventure University, so I'm
Oh,
also
nice.
a Franciscan. I've been formed by Franciscans. Yeah, when his name was announced, Leo the 14th, Catholic lovers of social justice and what we call Catholic social teaching around the world just gasped in joy because Pope Leo the 13th, so the last pope to have that name, is famous for a lot of reasons, but is most famous in those circles for being the pope who really established the tradition known as Catholic social teaching. His encyclical Rerum Novarum um, was an encyclical that was deeply anti-capitalist and was addressing the ways in which the kind of rise of capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other were creating a kind of modern industrial world where ordinary working people were being left behind and kind of treated as disposable. And so that encyclical Rerum Novarum was an attempt to really have the Catholic Church stand on the side of the dignity of workers and to try to craft a kind of middle way to create a just world in the modern context. There was speculation that he chose the name Leo the 14th to kind of stand in that tradition. And then, kind of within the first week of his papacy, speculation became kind of reality because he actually said Pope Leo the 13th dealt with an industrial revolution, and we're dealing with a new digital industrial revolution. And so he very much he took the name as a way to say that the church has something to say as we stand in this kind of crisis moment, has something to say about the dignity of humanity, in an age of AI. It has something to say about the dignity of workers, in a kind of hyper-capitalist world. Yeah, the name means a lot. If you want a little deep cut from an American Catholic historian, one of the things that I think is kind of fun about him taking that name as well is that Leo the 13th was also a pope who condemned what he called the heresy of Americanism.
Hmm.
Um, and what that meant was he condemned what he took to be attempts to adapt Catholicism to the kind of uh, distinctiveness of national cultures, right? So Leo the 13th was in a way saying that kind of like Catholicism is a global institution, a global tradition, and it shouldn't be kind of like remade in the likeness and image of particular nation states. So on the one hand, I think it's kind of funny that the first US American Pope would take the name of the guy who condemned Americanism. But in our current political context, when Christian nationalism is on the rise, not just in the United States but across the world, I think you might also read him taking Leo the 14th as a way of saying we're a global church, we're a church to be kind of united across the globe. We're not a church that should be kind of subdivided into kind of nationalist movements.
Yeah, there was an interesting moment along those lines where the Pope heard a question yelled at him from, I believe, an American journalist. And with you smiling, you probably know where I'm going with this. And the question was, do you have a word for the church in the United States? And he turned around and without missing a beat said, many. And then he walked off. And so that leads me to my next question, and that is, how do you think that this new pope, American born pope, albeit also a Peruvian citizen, will engage the church in the United States and engage where we find ourselves as a country geopolitically in the age of Trump 2.0?
Yeah. Yeah, I was laughing because that like moment was one of those like sunglasses descends on your face kind of moments. Like I have many things to say. So there's a Black Catholic priest who's a prominent kind of activist and intellectual who means a lot to me, Brian Massingale, who has this line that's particularly apt for our present moment, where he says that when we're talking about human dignity or justice, these aren't partisan values; these are gospel values. And I start with that because I think that Pope Leo the 14th, I expect him to carry on the legacy of Pope Francis. In being quite direct about what the gospel calls us to do with regard to immigrants and refugees, right, to the least of these, right, to the disinherited of the earth. And in our hyper-polarized political context in the United States, that is often kind of rebranded as partisan. But I think Leo the 14th and certainly Francis like didn't see it as taking a side in a political debate so much as it was about taking a side on the side of the gospel. And so I expect him to continue in that tradition, certainly on particularly, I should say, on the subject of immigrants. He was a missionary, in a Peruvian community and missioned to immigrants in a variety of different contexts. So, so I expect him to continue with that message. He also has, in these first few weeks, indicated a kind of openness to kind of explicitly being a bridge builder in a divided world. So he kind of publicly said, like, he's called for peace and an end to conflict, which was also a continuation of Francis's message, and invited, um, you know, Russia and Ukraine to like use the Vatican as a place to hold peace talks. And there have been a number of notable moments actually like in these kind of like big spectacle ritual days of the start of his papacy where President Zelensky like met with him or met with US officials in the Vatican. So um, I I think that he'll so that is like a way of working in a political world, and I wonder, this is not a prediction, just a kind of a wonder whether he will try to do similar things in terms of the political context, as far as America, the United States of America is concerned, in the sense of building bridges rather than exacerbating kind of polarization. So it'll be interesting, so I think that like he'll stand up for gospel values, but I wouldn't be surprised if he isn't quite as direct as Pope Francis was sometimes about his kind of condemnation of particular political figures. I think, and I'm going to expand it to be both about kind of the LGBTQ community, but also the role of women in the church. So one of the things that Francis really emphasized in his papacy was this process known as synodality. So synodality was this fancy way of saying kind of governing the church by gathering people together to listen to what they have to say, the kind of like fears and hopes, the needs and desires that folks have for what it means to live a Christian life. And that would happen in parishes, and then that would get kind of like reported up to dioceses, and then eventually was happening in the Vatican itself. Um, it's a very different model of church than some prior iterations of kind of Catholic kind of ecclesiology, right? That's very much more top down. I raised synodality because that's something that Pope Leo XIV talked about when he was cardinal. That was probably a big reason why he was elected pope, because he kind of talked about continuing that legacy of a listening church. Um, and also because it's in those listening spaces, in that synodality, where some of those um, issues were being raised in very concrete ways. So, for instance, there's a movement that has been afoot for a while to to allow women to become ordained deacons in the Catholic Church. In that process, in that listening process known as synodality, that's where a movement has been afoot to make women ordained deacons in the Catholic Church. So I named the process as a way of saying that this is something that Francis started, that Leo XIV has indicated he wants to continue, and could lead to some of that kind of opening of the church to women in positions of leadership and power in different ways than have been the case in recent Catholic history. And similarly, with regards to opening the doors to the LGBTQ community. I think that um, there, I would be shocked if Leo did anything, or maybe I shouldn't say shocked because I'm a historian of Catholicism, but I would be saddened and somewhat surprised if Leo were to really deviate in the tone of welcome and open arms to the LGBTQ community that Francis really kind of set down. I think that if Francis's papacy is a kind of indication of what we could expect from Leo, I think that what we would expect then would be um, no kind of radical shift in doctrine or kind of overarching kind of like law, but a continuation of an attempt to kind of open one's arms to a community to make them feel welcome. And you know, as I'm sure you and your congregants will appreciate, like those are not small things in religious communities. Like so priests being able to you know, something that happened under Pope Francis, priests being able to bless you know, civil unions of same-sex couples, like is not a small thing if you're a Catholic who is queer, right? Now, it's not as much as many of us, Catholic and non-Catholic, would hope for and like. But you know, I one of my fellow Catholic scholars of Catholics had this line when she was introducing uh, this pope to friends, and she was like, "If you're looking for a pope who is going to be great and progressive on issues of sexuality, you're never going to find that because that's not what the Catholic episcopate, you know, sadly, you know, it's not the nature of the Catholic episcopate. But I do expect Leo to kind of continue in the footsteps of Francis in terms of like being a kind of open arms. And that was even the kind of like message he gave when he was elected pope. He said, we're a pope, a mission, we're a missionary church, church of open arms."
Yeah, well, and as somebody who's served as a missionary in South America myself, I was intrigued um, uh, by that statement and by his background as a missionary, and how that will play on the emphases of his papacy. But I do think that change in any church, but especially the Roman Catholic Church, happens very slowly, and sometimes it is a matter of emphasis. Do you think also that that concept of synodality might also extend to the way in which the Pope might engage ecumenical partners and even non-Christian partners?
I think so. Yeah, there was. I mean, there was a practice when they were having. I'm almost certain that when they were actually got to the kind of culminating synods in the Vatican, that there were non-Catholic people present, like who are participants in that process. And there's already been an indication that Leo, in particular, has got a kind of an ecumenical kind of eye. I know that that was the kind of um, unity of the entire kind of Christian community was a big theme in Francis's papacy, and I think that Leo would be expected to continue that, but there's also some indications that he's even kind of hoping to expand that in terms of you know, reaching out to kind of Jewish and Muslim kind of partners as well. So yeah.
Well, Matt, I really appreciate you making the time, and apologize to those listening in for any technical difficulties. But I appreciate you taking the time to have us consider this American-born Pope, which is such a surprise, and you know, how he might continue forward much of what we saw during Francis's papacy. Appreciate you and appreciate those who've been listening in. I'll be back next month for another edition of Rector's Corner. In the meantime, friends, you stay safe and well, and you keep the faith. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.
Everybody.